Keanu Reeves walked slowly down the busy street in Los Angeles. The evening was cool, and the city lights shone bright around him, but he didn't draw much attention. He wore a black jacket that looked old, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His beard was a little rough, and his hair messy, as if he hadn't cared much about how he looked that day. People passed by him without a second glance. Some bumped into him without even saying sorry, but Keanu didn't seem to mind. He kept his hands in his pockets, quiet and calm. He stopped outside a small, trendy restaurant. Through the large glass window, he could see it was almost full. Inside, people laughed and enjoyed their meals. The place looked warm and inviting, with soft lights and friendly chatter filling the air. Keanu stepped inside, standing patiently. At the front, waiting for the hostess. The young woman at the front desk glanced at him, but didn't smile. Instead, she looked him up and down quickly, then whispered something to her colleague, and they both laughed softly. Without asking his name or whether he had a reservation, she turned away and helped another couple who had just entered. Keanu remained silent. He waited as others who came after him were seated before him. More than 10 minutes passed. The hostess walked by him twice, but acted like she didn't see him. A waiter glanced at him and frowned slightly, clearly wondering why this rough-looking man was standing there alone. Finally, Keanu gently asked, "Excuse me, is it possible to get a table?" The hostess sighed, as if annoyed, and quickly looked through her list. She pointed to a small table in the corner and said, "Fine, you can sit there." She didn't smile or even look at him properly. Without another word, Keanu walked over to the small table and sat down quietly. No one offered him a menu. He waited again, sitting alone while waiters rushed around helping other tables. A few minutes later, a waiter came over with an unfriendly face. He dropped a menu on the table without a greeting and walked away. As Keanu looked through the menu, he heard soft whispers from the nearby staff. They were talking about him, loud enough that he could hear. "He must be lost. Maybe he thinks this is a cheap diner," one said with a laugh. Another replied, "Look at his shoes, they're falling apart." But Keanu didn't react. He kept a calm face, quietly choosing his meal. When the waiter finally returned, he barely made eye contact. He took Keanu's order quickly, then rushed off without saying anything polite. Around him, the restaurant was full of energy. People laughed, glasses clinked, and waiters moved quickly to keep other guests happy. But Keanu sat in silence. His water glass stayed empty. No one checked on him. Minutes turned into nearly half an hour, and still, no food came to his table. At one point, a waiter spilled water nearby and didn't even apologize when the splash reached Keanu's shoes. Some guests sitting near him noticed the way the staff were behaving but didn't realize who he was. To them, he just looked like a man down on his luck. But Keanu stayed peaceful. He didn't complain, didn't call the manager, and didn't even show signs of frustration. He simply waited. His kindness and patience were clear, even though no one else seemed to see it. For most people, being treated like this would have been embarrassing or upsetting. But Keanu had always been different. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He wasn't looking for attention. He had just come for a quiet meal, hoping for a simple, peaceful evening. He didn't care about being famous at that moment. He didn't expect special treatment. All he wanted was to sit, eat, and enjoy some quiet time after what had probably been a long day. Yet the staff didn't see this side of him. To them, he was invisible, maybe even annoying. Their judgment was based only on his clothes, his quiet manner, and his simple appearance. They didn't know they were ignoring a Hollywood star, a man known around the world not just for his movies, but for his kindness and humility. As Keanu sat there, his stomach empty and his patience being quietly tested, something unexpected was about to happen. The front door of the restaurant opened again, and the soft sounds of conversation dropped for a moment. A famous face was about to walk in, someone who would change everything that night. But for now, Keanu remained calm, sitting alone at that small corner table, waiting quietly, even as people continued to look past him, even after waiting so long. Keanu stayed calm at his small corner table. The noise of the restaurant continued around him, people laughing, glasses clinking, waiters moving quickly, but none of it seemed to include him. It was like he was invisible. He looked down at his empty water glass. The waiter had promised to bring water earlier, but never returned. His meal hadn't arrived either, even though people who had come much later were already eating and enjoying themselves. The staff still didn't seem to care about him. In fact, they kept whispering about him as they passed by. "What's he even doing here?" one of the waiters muttered while walking past his table. Another waiter laughed softly, replying, "I don't think he can even afford to eat here." Keanu heard their words, but he didn't show any anger or disappointment. He just sat there, patient and silent. Many people in his place would have gotten upset or walked out. But not Keanu. He simply sat, waiting politely, as if he didn't notice the rude comments out at one point. The waiter who had taken his order returned, but not with food or water. He just looked down at Keanu's table and said in a cold tone, "We're busy tonight, you know." Then he walked away again without waiting for a response. The other staff nearby smirked, treating Keanu as if he didn't deserve respect. The atmosphere around his table felt cold, while the rest of the restaurant was full of warmth and laughter. Some customers near him noticed how poorly he was being treated but didn't say anything. To them, he looked like just an ordinary man who didn't belong in this fancy place. They didn't recognize who he really was. They didn't realize that this quiet man was Keanu Reeves, a world-famous actor known not just for his films but for his kindness and humility. Keanu remained peaceful. He didn't seem bothered by their behavior. He didn't call out to the waiter, didn't demand better service, and didn't make a scene. He simply waited, looking around the restaurant quietly. Maybe he was used to being judged for how he looked. Maybe he had learned to stay calm even when people treated him unfairly. The minutes dragged on. Other guests around him were laughing, taking pictures of their food and enjoying their evening, while Keanu sat quietly, still hungry, still waiting for the meal he had ordered a long time ago. The kitchen staff even seemed to ignore his order. The waiter who was supposed to serve him leaned on the counter, laughing with another waiter and glancing at Keanu's table now and then. "Still waiting," one of them joked softly, shaking his head. But Keanu's face stayed the same calm, gentle and without complaint. He watched them for a moment but didn't say a word. His silence made their rude behavior stand out even more. At that moment, Keanu was a picture of patience and grace. He could have left. He could have argued. He could have shown them who he really was and demanded better treatment. But instead, he chose to stay quiet and kind, even when others weren't showing him the same respect. Then something unexpected happened. The restaurant door opened again, and the sound caught everyone's attention. The laughter and conversation dropped for just a second. Someone important had walked in, a person who would soon change everything in that restaurant that night. Keanu noticed too. He looked toward the door, and a small smile appeared on his face. He recognized the person immediately, but he didn't wave or call out. He just waited, sitting quietly at his lonely table. The staff, however, rushed to the door. Their attitude changed instantly. The waiters who had ignored Keanu moments ago suddenly became full of energy and respect. The hostess, who had been cold and careless, ran to greet the new guest with a big, polite smile. That new guest was none other than Gordon Ramsay, the famous chef known around the world, not just for his cooking skills, but also for his sharp eyes and honesty. The staff welcomed him like a hero, hoping he would notice their work and maybe even praise their restaurant. But as soon as Gordon stepped inside, his sharp gaze swept across the room, and it didn't take him long to notice what was going on. His eyes fell on Keanu, sitting alone in the corner, looking peaceful but still without food or water. Gordon's face grew serious. He understood immediately that something wasn't right. And just like that, the quiet, cold atmosphere around Keanu's table was about to change. The moment Gordon Ramsay stepped inside, the whole atmosphere shifted. The staff who had been so careless and rude just moments before suddenly straightened their backs, fixed their clothes, and smiled brightly. Some waiters even rushed toward him, hoping to serve him personally. They all knew Gordon Ramsay was a world-famous chef and TV personality, and they wanted to make a good impression. Gordon, however, didn't seem interested in their greetings. His sharp eyes scanned the restaurant quickly. He wasn't just there to enjoy a meal. He could sense when something wasn't right, and something definitely wasn't right here. He noticed the staff behaving nervously, their smiles a little too wide, their energy a little too forced. Then his eyes landed on Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly at a small table in the corner. Keanu looked peaceful as always, but Gordon could tell he'd been waiting too long. The empty glass on the table, the lack of food, the way no waiter was nearby, all of it told Gordon that this guest had not been treated properly. He recognized Keanu immediately, but he also understood that this was not about celebrity or fame. It was about respect, and clearly, respect was missing. Without a word to the staff, Gordon walked straight across the restaurant and headed toward Keanu's table. The room grew quieter as some guests and staff watched, curious about what Gordon was doing. Keanu, noticing Gordon coming closer, gave a small warm smile but didn't stand up. His calm nature stayed the same, even now. Gordon reached the table and greeted Keanu warmly. They shook hands like old friends, and Gordon sat down right across from him without asking. The staff froze where they stood, their fake smiles fading quickly. They hadn't expected this. They had ignored Keanu earlier, thinking he was just a poor, ordinary man who didn't belong. Now the famous Gordon Ramsay was sitting with him, treating him with respect and kindness. Gordon looked around and raised his hand, calling over the manager. His voice was firm, but not loud. "Come here, please," he said. The manager, looking nervous and a little pale, quickly walked over to the table. Gordon asked him simply, "Why has this guest been sitting here without food or water for so long?" The manager struggled to answer. He stammered, offering weak excuses about being busy and having a full restaurant that evening. But Gordon didn't accept that. He looked directly at the manager and said, "Being busy is not an excuse to treat any guest this way. This man has been waiting quietly and patiently, while your staff whispered about him and ignored him. You need to think about what that says about your service." The entire restaurant seemed to fall quiet. Even guests who didn't recognize Keanu were watching now, realizing that something unusual was happening. The staff, who had earlier laughed and whispered behind Keanu's back, now looked embarrassed and unsure what to do. Gordon didn't stop there. He waved over a waiter and asked him, "Where is this gentleman's food? How long has he been waiting?" The waiter couldn't look Gordon in the eye and mumbled something about the kitchen being backed up. Gordon shook his head. "That's not good enough," he said. "A true restaurant should treat every guest with kindness and respect, no matter what they look like or what they're wearing." Throughout all of this, Keanu remained quiet. He didn't speak up, didn't complain, and didn't interrupt Gordon. He simply sat there, watching calmly as Gordon spoke on his behalf. There was no anger on his face, just the same gentle patience he had shown from the beginning. Gordon then turned back to Keanu and smiled warmly. "Let's have dinner together," he said, as if the two had planned to meet all along. "And let me make sure everything that comes from that kitchen is perfect." Keanu nodded quietly, appreciating Gordon's kindness but not showing off or acting proud. He was just happy to finally be treated like a human being, with simple respect. The staff quickly rushed to fix their mistakes. The waiter brought a glass of fresh, cold water and menus for both Keanu and Gordon. The kitchen was suddenly working faster, preparing Keanu's meal properly. Now that Gordon was watching closely, other guests whispered among themselves, realizing that the quiet man they had ignored earlier was someone special, not just because he was famous, but because of the way he stayed humble and patient, despite everything. In just a few moments, Gordon Ramsay had completely changed the mood of the restaurant. His simple act of noticing Keanu and standing up for him sent a clear message to everyone. True kindness means treating everyone with dignity, no matter who they are. After Gordon Ramsay sat at Keanu's table, the whole restaurant seemed to breathe differently. The staff, who had ignored and laughed at Keanu just minutes ago, were now running around nervously. The waiter, who had been cold and rude earlier, now appeared eager to help, standing nearby, waiting for any sign from Gordon or Keanu. Even the manager stayed close, watching everything carefully, afraid to upset Gordon again. But Gordon didn't care about their sudden change in attitude. His focus was fully on Keanu. He looked across the table at Keanu, smiling gently, and asked, "Have they brought you water yet?" Keanu shook his head calmly. Gordon raised his hand and called the waiter over again. "Water for my friend." "Here and quickly, please," he said firmly. The waiter rushed to bring a tall glass of cold water and placed it carefully in front of Keanu, as if hoping this simple act would erase all the earlier disrespect. But Gordon didn't forget what had happened. He knew exactly how this restaurant had treated Keanu before he walked in. Keanu, as always, stayed humble and quiet. He took a sip of water, nodded in thanks, and placed the glass down gently. Gordon then leaned forward, asking, "So, what were you thinking of ordering tonight?" Keanu smiled slightly and opened the menu that had finally been given to him. They talked about the dishes like two old friends sharing a casual dinner, even though they hadn't planned to meet that evening. While they spoke, Gordon kept glancing toward the kitchen. He could tell that the staff were now moving quickly to prepare Keanu's order properly. The cooks looked nervous, knowing that Gordon's sharp eyes would judge every detail of the food they sent out. Other guests in the restaurant watched quietly, many realizing that the man they had ignored earlier was Keanu Reeves. They whispered among themselves, feeling a little embarrassed that they hadn't recognized him, but even more embarrassed that they too had judged him by his simple clothes and quiet nature. Soon, Keanu's food arrived at the table. The waiter placed the plate carefully in front of him, standing straighter than before and speaking politely. "Your meal, sir," he said, almost in a whisper. Gordon didn't let the moment pass. He inspected the plate carefully, checking the presentation, the temperature, and even the smell of the food. He nodded slowly, satisfied that at least now the restaurant was trying its best. "Finally," he said softly, looking at Keanu, "you get what you should have received from the start." Keanu smiled gently. He didn't act angry, proud, or superior. He simply appreciated that now he was being treated like any other guest. He picked up his fork and began to eat quietly, enjoying the meal in peace for the first time that evening. While they ate, Gordon kept the conversation light. He made a few quiet jokes, shared a few stories from his travels, and even asked Keanu how he had been. They looked like two old friends catching up over dinner, creating a warm and human moment in the middle of a restaurant that had earlier been cold and unfriendly. The staff, however, couldn't relax. They continued to glance nervously at Gordon's table, knowing that their behavior had been seen and judged by one of the most respected chefs in the world. At one point, the manager approached the table again, this time offering a fake smile and saying, "If there's anything else we can do for you tonight, please let us know." Gordon looked at him calmly and said, "You can treat every guest with the same respect you're showing now, not just the ones you recognize." His words were simple but powerful. The manager nodded quickly, realizing that this moment was more than just about serving food. It was about learning a lesson in kindness, respect, and humility. Keanu finished his meal quietly. As he sat back in his chair, he looked around the restaurant. The same people who had ignored him earlier now stared at him with respect and maybe even a little shame. But Keanu didn't look angry or upset. His peaceful nature stayed the same. Gordon smiled at Keanu, then stood up slowly. "It was good to see you tonight," he said kindly. Keanu nodded, thanking him quietly, his voice soft and genuine. The two men walked out together, leaving behind a restaurant that had been completely transformed by this unexpected moment. Gordon's small act of kindness had changed not only the mood of the evening, but had also given everyone in that room quiet reminder that kindness matters and that respect should never depend on fame, clothes, or appearance. After Gordon Ramsay sat with Keanu, everything changed around them. The waiter who had ignored Keanu earlier now stood nearby, ready to help at a moment's notice. The kitchen that had once forgotten Keanu's order was now fully focused, preparing food quickly and carefully. The restaurant that had treated him like he didn't matter was now treating him as a special guest. But it wasn't because they realized who he was. It was because Gordon was sitting with him. Keanu remained as humble and quiet as before. He didn't act angry or arrogant. He simply appreciated that someone had noticed him, had stood up for him when he was being treated unfairly. Gordon smiled across the table, making small jokes and telling stories about his travels and kitchen adventures. Keanu listened quietly, smiling gently and nodding politely. Even though the two were very different, there was an easy, natural respect between them. As they ate, the staff tried hard to impress Gordon. The waiter checked on them constantly, making sure everything was perfect. The manager watched from a distance, nervous that Gordon might criticize something. But Gordon didn't say much to them anymore. His attention was on Keanu, making sure he was enjoying his meal. The other diners in the restaurant kept sneaking glances toward their table. Some whispered quietly to each other, realizing that the quiet man sitting with Gordon Ramsay was actually Keanu Reeves. A few looked embarrassed. They had ignored him earlier, or even judged him, just because of how he looked. Now they saw him differently. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a man who had shown patience and grace even when treated unfairly. Keanu's food, which had taken forever to arrive before, now came quickly and perfectly prepared. Gordon checked every dish as it arrived, making sure it met his high standards. Even though this wasn't his restaurant, Gordon acted as if it was his responsibility to ensure that Keanu was treated properly. But for Keanu, it wasn't about the food anymore. It was about feeling respected, feeling seen as a person. He didn't demand special treatment because he was famous. He just wanted the same kindness and care that should be shown to every guest. Throughout the meal, Gordon continued to show kindness in quiet ways. He didn't draw attention to himself or Keanu. He didn't scold the staff loudly or make a scene. Instead, he led by example, showing respect, speaking kindly, and treating Keanu like an equal, a friend. The staff began to understand this too. They realized that their job wasn't just to serve food. It was to make every person who walked through the door feel welcome, feel cared for, no matter how they looked or who they were. After they finished eating, Gordon leaned back and smiled. "That was better," he said warmly. Keanu nodded quietly, agreeing. The meal had turned into something special, not just because the food was good, but because of the kindness that had been shown. As Gordon stood up, he placed a gentle hand on the waiter's shoulder. His tone was soft but serious as he said, "Remember, respect isn't just for famous people. Every guest matters." The waiter nodded quickly, understanding that this night had taught them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Keanu stood too, thanking Gordon quietly for sitting with him. He didn't say much, but his eyes showed true appreciation. He hadn't asked for anyone to help him, but Gordon had stepped in anyway, not for attention, but because it was the right thing to do. As they walked toward the door together, the entire restaurant seemed to pause. The staff, the manager, and many of the guests watched them go, knowing they had just witnessed something important. It wasn't just about a celebrity encounter. It was about human kindness, patience, and standing up for what's right. Outside the restaurant, the cool evening air felt calm and peaceful. Gordon and Keanu shared a few quiet words before going their separate ways. There were no cameras following them, no press waiting outside. It was just two men who had shared a simple meal, a meal that had started with disrespect but had ended with dignity. Back inside the restaurant, the staff stood quietly, thinking about what had happened. The manager gathered them together and spoke softly, reminding them that from that moment on, they needed to treat every guest the way they should have treated Keanu that night, with care, respect, and kindness. And even though Keanu never raised his voice, never argued, and never demanded anything, his quiet patience had taught them all a powerful lesson. After Keanu and Gordon left the restaurant, a strange silence filled the place. The staff, who had been rushing around and acting polite after Gordon arrived, now stood still, thinking about everything that had happened. The manager gathered the waiters quietly and spoke in a soft voice, but his words were clear. From now on, we treat every guest with kindness, no exceptions. We must not repeat what happened tonight. Some of the waiters nodded, still feeling embarrassed about how they had behaved earlier. They realized that Keanu had never done anything wrong. He had walked in quietly, waited patiently, and never once raised his voice, even when he was ignored and disrespected. It was only when Gordon Ramsay noticed and stepped in that they finally understood how poorly they had treated him. At other tables, guests talked softly about what they had seen. A few admitted to themselves that they, too, had judged Keanu by his clothes and appearance. They had assumed he didn't belong in a fancy restaurant just because he wasn't dressed like the others, but now they knew better. They had witnessed something important, a reminder that everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like. Outside, Keanu and Gordon walked together for a few minutes before parting ways. Keanu thanked Gordon again, but in his usual quiet and humble way. He didn't act like a celebrity. He didn't brag or show off. Instead, he smiled gently, grateful for Gordon's kindness and support. Gordon smiled back and placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder for a moment before heading in another direction. That simple moment between them showed a deep respect. Gordon didn't help Keanu because he was famous. He helped because it was the right thing to do. And Keanu accepted that kindness without making a scene, showing his gentle and humble nature. Once again, the next day, word about what happened spread quietly across social media. Someone in the restaurant had taken a picture of Gordon sitting with Keanu, and the story quickly went viral. People shared it everywhere, writing about how Gordon had stood up for Keanu and how Keanu had stayed so calm and kind throughout the evening. Many people who read the story felt inspired. They admired Gordon for speaking up when something felt wrong. But they admired Keanu even more for his patience, his humility, and the way he treated everyone with quiet respect, even when they did not treat him the same way. People online wrote comments like, "Keanu is a true example of patience and grace," and Gordon Ramsay did the right thing by reminding everyone that respect is for all. Some even said the story made them think about their own behavior, whether they judged others too quickly based on appearance. At the same time, the restaurant itself felt the impact. Their name was shared online, and many people criticized them for how they had treated Keanu before Gordon arrived. The manager decided to issue a public apology, not just to Keanu but to all guests. He promised to train his staff better, so that kindness and respect would come first, always. Inside the restaurant, changes began immediately. The staff no longer whispered about customers or judged them based on how they looked. They served every guest with a smile and treated them as equals. The manager made sure new staff learned this lesson too. It wasn't just about good food anymore, it was about being good people. For Keanu, this entire experience was just another quiet chapter in his life. He didn't share his side of the story online or look for praise. He went back to living his life simply, with the same kindness he showed every day. But for those who saw him that night, both in the restaurant and online, the lesson stayed with them. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about the power of kindness and patience. Keanu had shown that you don't have to fight back loudly to make a difference. Sometimes your calm presence and quiet strength can speak louder than words. And Gordon's role in that evening reminded people that sometimes it takes just one person to stand up and say, "This isn't right," to change the whole atmosphere. His simple act of sitting with Keanu had turned a cold, disrespectful night into a lesson that no one in that restaurant, or anyone who heard the story later, would ever forget. Even though Keanu didn't ask for help, and even though he never complained, Gordon's kindness and Keanu's grace together created a powerful moment that would inspire many people far beyond that one restaurant. Days passed, but the story of Keanu and Gordon kept spreading. People who had read about it online shared it with their friends and family, calling it a beautiful example of kindness and patience. Many were touched by how Keanu stayed calm even when he was treated badly, and how Gordon had quietly but firmly stepped in to make things right. Inside the restaurant, things were different now. The staff remembered that night clearly. They talked less and worked harder. They no longer judged guests by how they looked or what they wore. Every customer was treated with respect and care. Even the manager acted differently. He spent more time checking on guests himself, making sure everyone felt welcome. The story also changed the way some guests behaved. Some of them, who had witnessed the entire situation that night, returned again in the following days. But this time, they smiled at everyone around them. They spoke more kindly to the staff, and they looked at other guests with more understanding. It was like that one evening had taught everyone a quiet but powerful lesson. For Keanu, though, life went on as it always did. He never talked publicly about what happened. He didn't post about it online or give interviews. That was just the kind of person he was: quiet, humble, and peaceful. To him, there was nothing special about staying calm that night. It was simply the way he lived his life, choosing patience and kindness even when others didn't show him the same. Gordon, on the other hand, also never made a big deal about what he had done. He didn't seek attention or praise. He had seen something unfair happening and had acted immediately, not because Keanu was famous, but because every guest deserved respect. He led by example, showing that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. The restaurant slowly rebuilt its reputation. Though many people online had criticized their behavior that night, some also praised them for learning from their mistake. The staff trained harder, and the restaurant became known not just for its food, but for treating guests with warmth and respect. In a way, Keanu and Gordon had left a quiet mark on the place that would last a long time. Outside the restaurant, the story kept inspiring people all over the world. Many readers said they felt differently after hearing about that evening. They promised themselves they would treat others with more patience, no matter what someone looked like or where they came from. Some said the story made them think about their own behavior, whether they had ever ignored someone simply because they looked ordinary. It was clear that Keanu's quiet patience and Gordon's brave kindness had touched more people than they would ever know. The two men never spoke about the event again, but the message they had left behind was powerful. One small act of kindness, just noticing a man sitting alone and being ignored, had turned into a lesson for so many people. And the way Keanu handled it all with grace and calm showed that true strength doesn't come from fame or money or power. It comes from being kind even when no one is watching. It comes from being patient even when you're treated unfairly. For those who had been in the restaurant that night, the memory stayed fresh. The staff remembered how quickly things had changed when Gordon walked in. They remembered how embarrassed they felt when they realized who Keanu was, but more importantly, They remembered how wrong it was to treat anyone that way. In the days and weeks that followed, they made sure it never happened again. They greeted every guest with a smile, offered water immediately, and made sure no one felt ignored. It was as if the entire restaurant had been given a second chance, and this time, they were determined to get it right. And for those who read the story later, even if they had never met Keanu or Gordon, it became a reminder that kindness matters. That you never know who the quiet person in the corner might be. That every act of respect, no matter how small, can change someone's day or even someone's life. Keanu had walked into that restaurant hoping for a quiet meal, and he had left without ever asking for anything more than basic kindness. Gordon had walked in later, seen something that didn't feel right, and used his voice to make things better. Together, without planning it, they had created a story that touched hearts around the world. And that's the real beauty of kindness. It can happen anywhere, anytime, in the smallest and simplest ways. You never know when just sitting with someone, noticing them, or standing up for them might leave a lasting impact. And that night, in that small restaurant, that's exactly what happened.